Please save my husband. I will pay later.
Madam, to save your husband, you need to pay first. I heard your daughter is abroad.
My daughter, please send us money for food and your father's medicines. We are in the hospital.
Mama, I have told you I have no money. I am also struggling here.
This bag cost $20,000. I will pay with my card.
The scorching afternoon sun burned over the dusty farmland as Grace's father struggled weakly between rows of cassava. Sweat poured down his face, his vision blurred, then suddenly he collapsed hard onto the ground. "Papa!" a nearby farmer screamed as people rushed toward him in panic. At that same moment, thousands of miles away, inside a glittering luxury party filled with music and champagne, Grace laughed softly among wealthy friends as cameras flashed around her. Inside her handbag, her phone vibrated non-stop. Mama calling. Again, again, again. Back in the village hospital, nurses blocked Grace's mother from entering the treatment room. "We need payment fast," one nurse shouted. Her mother dialed Grace's number with trembling hands. Inside the ballroom, one of Grace's rich friends laughed. "Who keeps calling you like that?" Embarrassed, Grace looked at the screen for a moment, then switched off her phone. Back in the hospital bed, her dying father whispered weakly, "Has Grace called?" Her parents sacrificed everything to make that dream come true, but when success finally came, she forgot the people who suffered for her. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and like this video for more powerful emotional stories. In a small, forgotten village, where dust covered the roads like brown powder, and hunger lived in almost every house, Grace grew up inside a leaking mud home at the edge of the community. When heavy rain fell at night, her mother placed old buckets around the room to catch the water dripping from the weak roof. Sometimes, the cold wind entered through the cracked walls, and the family would huddle together in silence until morning came. Every day before sunrise, tired women carried empty buckets to fetch dirty water from a far stream, while children with dusty feet ran around with hungry eyes. Grace's father left home each morning with an old hoe resting on his shoulder, walking slowly toward borrowed farmland under the burning sun. His body was always tired, but he never complained. Her mother spent long hours in the market selling cassava and vegetables just to buy a little gari for the family. Grace helped her every evening, spreading sliced cassava on old trays outside their house, while goats wandered around the compound searching for food. Then one afternoon, while the hot wind blew softly across the village, a loud sound suddenly rolled across the sky. Grace looked up quickly and froze. A silver airplane was flying high above the clouds like something from another world. Her eyes widened with wonder. "Mommy," she whispered softly, "do people really live inside that thing?" Her mother looked up at the airplane and smiled weakly. "Yes," she replied, "important people." Grace stared at the disappearing aircraft for a long moment before speaking again. "One day I will enter one." Her mother smiled, but deep inside her, fear mixed with sadness. In that village, dreams were dangerous because poverty had a way of breaking people before life even gave them a chance. But Grace was different. She was intelligent, gentle, and hard-working. Even when other children played in the fields, Grace sat quietly with old, torn books balanced on her knees. At night, while mosquitoes bit her skin endlessly, she studied under a weak kerosene lamp until her eyes became red with exhaustion. Every morning before school, she walked barefoot on rough, dusty roads for almost an hour because her parents could not afford proper shoes. Sometimes, richer students laughed at her torn uniform and mocked the holes in her sandals. Village girl, they called her. But Grace never fought them. She simply lowered her head and continued walking toward her classroom. At home, her parents watched her silently, with both pride and pain. Many nights, her father pretended he was not hungry, so Grace could eat the last portion of food. I already ate outside. He would lie quietly while drinking only water before sleeping. Late at night, after Grace fell asleep, her mother sat under the dim lantern, carefully patching her torn school uniform with trembling fingers while tears rolled silently down her cheeks. One night, Grace woke up unexpectedly and heard her parents speaking softly outside the room. "We are suffering too much," her mother whispered painfully. Her father remained silent for a moment before answering. "Even if we suffer today, your future must not suffer with us." Those words stayed inside Grace's heart forever. Years passed and Grace continued fighting through every humiliation, every hunger, and every hardship until finally she became the best graduating student in her school. The entire village exploded with celebration. Women danced joyfully. Men shook her father's hand proudly. Children followed Grace like she was already a celebrity. For the first time in many years, her parents smiled without hiding their pain. But beneath the celebration and laughter, one silent question remained inside every heart. What happens next? The day Grace graduated from the university felt like a festival inside the village. From early morning, women gathered outside her parents' small house, singing songs of celebration, while children ran around beating empty buckets like drums. Her mother wore her best wrapper, even though the fabric had faded from age, and her father borrowed a clean shirt from a neighbor because he wanted to look respectable for his daughter's big day. When Grace finally appeared in her graduation gown, her mother burst into tears immediately. Her father could not stop smiling as he stared at her with proud eyes. To him, it felt like all the years of hunger, suffering, and sacrifice were finally coming to an end. Villagers shook his hands and congratulated him warmly. "Your daughter will change your life now," they said. That evening, the family ate rice and chicken for the first time in many months. Even though the food was small, they laughed like rich people around the table. For the first time in years, hope filled the house completely. But after the celebration ended, reality entered quietly like an unwelcome visitor. Weeks passed after graduation, yet no job came. Every morning before sunrise, Grace dressed neatly and carried her file from one hospital to another searching for work. She stood in long crowded queues under the hot sun while hundreds of other graduates pushed and struggled around her. Sometimes nurses collected their documents without even looking at their faces. Other times she was told, "We will call you," but the calls never came. Rejection letters slowly filled her small bag. Transportation became another suffering. Many days Grace trekked long distances because she could not afford transport fare home. She returned every evening with swollen feet and tired eyes while pretending to smile so her parents would not worry. But her parents already knew. At night, her mother quietly reduced the amount of food she served during dinner so the little they had could last longer. Debts continued increasing. Her father's body grew weaker from years of hard labor, yet he still forced himself to work on farms every day. Sometimes he coughed badly at night when nobody was listening. Still, whenever Grace apologized sadly, he smiled and said, "Do not worry, your time will come." But the village had already started talking. Neighbors who once praised Grace now mocked the family openly. Education does not feed people, some said loudly whenever Grace walked past. After wasting all that money, she is still sitting at home. One afternoon, Grace overheard two women gossiping near the stream. If she had learnt business instead of wasting years in school, she would be helping her parents by now, one woman said. Grace stood silently behind a tree, listening while tears gathered in her eyes. That night, she cried quietly alone inside the darkness, feeling like a heavy burden on the people who loved her most. Then one hot afternoon, everything suddenly changed. A letter arrived from a foreign hospital offering Grace a training opportunity abroad. The moment she finished reading it aloud, silence filled the entire room. Her mother covered her mouth in shock while her father stared at the paper as though he could not believe what he was seeing. It felt like heaven itself had finally remembered their suffering. But the excitement did not last long. When they discovered how much the visa process, flight ticket and travel expenses would cost, fear returned immediately. The amount was bigger than anything the family had ever seen in their lives.
That night, long after Grace had gone to sleep, her parents sat outside their leaking house under the quiet moonlight. Her mother cried softly into her wrapper, while her father stared silently into the darkness for a long time. The sound of crickets filled the cold night air. "We cannot afford this," her mother whispered painfully. Her father remained silent for a moment before speaking slowly. "If suffering is the price for her future," he looked toward the small room where Grace slept, "then let us suffer." After that night, Grace's parents began sacrificing everything they had little by little, as though they were slowly tearing pieces from their own lives. Her father was the first to act. One morning, before the sun fully rose, he walked quietly to the small ancestral land that had belonged to his family for generations. It was the same land where his own father had farmed before dying many years ago. He stood there silently for a long time, staring at the dry soil with heavy eyes, before finally selling it to a wealthy man from another village. People were shocked when they heard the news. "That land is all he has," villagers whispered. But her father said nothing. Days later, he sold his farming tools, then the family goat, then their old bicycle that Grace used while growing up. Each sacrifice left the house emptier than before. Her mother also began selling everything she owned. First, it was her small market stall that had fed the family for years. Then, her wedding jewelry disappeared quietly one evening. Even the cooking pots and utensils inside the kitchen reduced one after another until the shelves looked almost bare. Still, the money was not enough. Soon, they began visiting relatives for help, carrying shame in their hearts. Some relatives welcomed them coldly, while others pretended not to have money. One wealthy uncle laughed bitterly after hearing their request. "You people want to throw money away chasing foreign dreams," he said. "What if the girl fails?" Grace's mother lowered her head silently as tears filled her eyes. They also borrowed from cruel moneylenders whose voices carried no mercy. The men often visited the house, speaking harshly in front of neighbors. "If you fail to pay us back, we will collect everything you own," one of them warned loudly. Villagers gossiped endlessly. "They are suffering too much because of one child," some said. "What if she never returns?" But despite the humiliation, Grace's parents refused to stop. To them, this was no longer just a dream. It was their only hope of escaping the poverty that had tortured the family for generations. Finally, the day of Grace's departure arrived. Her mother barely slept the night before. While everyone rested, she quietly woke up in the darkness and cooked rice and stew, packing the food carefully into small containers for Grace to eat during the journey. From time to time, she stopped cooking just to wipe tears from her face. Outside the house, Grace's father sat alone on an old wooden bench, pretending to be strong. But when nobody was watching, tears rolled slowly down his face. By morning, the entire village gathered at the bus park to send Grace away. Children danced around excitedly, while women prayed loudly for her success. Some villagers hugged her proudly, as though she already belonged to another world. Grace's mother held her tightly and refused to let go for several seconds. Then, slowly, she removed a small Bible from her wrapper and placed it into Grace's trembling hands. "Promise me something," she whispered painfully. Grace nodded through tears. Her mother looked directly into her eyes. "Promise me success will never make us ashamed of us." Grace burst into tears immediately and hugged her tightly. "Never," she cried. "I will never forget you." When the bus engine finally started, the entire park became emotional. Grace climbed inside slowly, while her mother cried openly beside the window. As the bus began moving away, her mother suddenly ran after it for a few seconds, calling Grace's name while waving desperately through tears. Her father remained standing silently behind her, his face filled with pain too deep for words. Around them, village children waved excitedly as the bus disappeared down the dusty road. Hours later, Grace's parents returned home quietly. The house felt painfully empty now. The livestock were gone, the cooking pots were gone, even the land that carried their family history no longer belonged to them. Yet, as they sat together inside the almost empty room that night, they still comforted themselves with one hope: their daughter would make all the suffering worth it someday.
When Grace finally arrived abroad, the excitement inside her heart disappeared almost immediately. The cold alone felt like punishment. The first time she saw snow falling from the sky, she stood outside shivering in fear and confusion as white flakes covered the streets, the cars, and even her hair. Back home, she had only seen such things in television movies. But there was nothing magical about it now. The cold entered her bones like needles, and many nights she cried quietly under thin blankets because her body could not adjust. Everything around her felt strange. The people spoke too fast, the city moved too fast. Even the silence inside her tiny apartment felt heavy and lonely. Sometimes, while walking on the streets, strangers stared at her skin with cold eyes. Some ignored her completely. Others spoke to her rudely because of her accent. One afternoon, while she was cleaning inside an office building, a woman looked at her name tag and said carelessly, "These foreigners come here to take all the jobs." Grace smiled painfully and continued walking, but later that night she cried alone inside the bathroom. Life abroad was nothing like the beautiful dream she once imagined under the village sky. To survive, Grace worked endlessly. During the day, she attended hospital training classes with exhausted eyes. At night, she cleaned office floors until her hands became rough from chemicals. On weekends, she washed dishes in a restaurant kitchen filled with heat and noise. Sometimes, she cared for elderly patients who screamed at her angrily because they did not understand her accent. Many nights, she returned home so tired that she slept without eating. There were days hunger followed her like a shadow because almost all her money went into rent, transportation, and school expenses. Yet, back home, her parents suffered silently too.
The moneylenders kept visiting the house with threats and insults. Her father, despite growing older and weaker, worked harder than ever on other people's farms just to survive. His hands became rougher, his cough worsened. Sometimes he returned home limping from exhaustion, but he never told Grace the full truth because he did not want her to lose focus. During phone calls, both sides hid their pain from each other. Grace would force herself to sound cheerful, even after crying moments earlier. "I'm fine, Mama," she always said. Back in the village, her mother smiled through hunger and replied, "We are proud of you. Just keep going." Those calls became the only thing keeping them alive emotionally. Years passed slowly, like a long storm that refused to end. Then, one day, the suffering finally began to change. Grace completed her training successfully and graduated. Soon after, she got a real hospital job with a good salary. For the first time in her life, she began earning money that felt impossible to imagine before. When Grace called home with the news, her mother screamed with joy so loudly that neighbors rushed into the house thinking something terrible had happened. Her father danced outside like a young man despite his weak body. That evening, the entire village celebrated again. Women sang songs late into the night while men congratulated her father proudly. Everywhere he went, he spoke about Grace with shining eyes. "My daughter will save this family," he told everyone happily. For the first time in many years, hope finally felt real. None of them knew that the very success they had prayed for would one day become the beginning of their greatest pain. After Grace started earning well, her life abroad slowly changed like a dream, turning into something shiny but dangerous. She moved out of her small, struggling apartment into a cleaner place with soft lights, warm heating, and furniture that looked like it belonged to another world. At first, she was still the same humble girl from the village, but little by little, comfort began to change her. She started going to expensive restaurants where the plates were small but the prices were high. She learned new ways of speaking, carefully adjusting her accent so she would not sound different. She bought designer clothes she once could never pronounce and began sitting with a new group of friends who dressed like magazines and spoke like success was something they were born with. These friends often laughed loudly about poor countries. One of them once said at dinner, "I don't understand how people survive in places like Africa. It must be so backward." Another laughed and added, "Imagine coming from a village and trying to fit into real life here." Grace forced a small smile, but something inside her tightened. At first, she defended her roots quietly. She would say, "Not everyone lives like that. My parents are hard-working people." But the laughter around the table often made her words feel small. Slowly, she stopped correcting them. Slowly, silence became easier. The more she stayed with them, the more she began hiding her background. When her phone rang in front of them and she saw her mother's name, she would quickly reject the call and say, "It's just spam." Her friends would laugh and move on, not knowing the truth she was burying. Over time, Grace began to feel ashamed of where she came from. She stopped posting pictures of her parents. She stopped talking about her village. The girl who once cried for her family now carefully avoided anything that reminded her of them in public. Meanwhile, far away, her parents lived a very different life. Her mother sometimes skipped meals so her husband could eat a little more. Her father still worked on farms despite his weak body, coughing heavily under the sun while pretending he was fine. One day, while Grace was sitting in a luxury store trying on an expensive handbag, her phone rang again and again. It was her mother. Grace stepped aside and answered softly, "Mama, I'm a bit busy."
Her mother's voice was shaking with fear. "Your father has been very sick. He can barely stand. We need help, Grace." Grace looked around at her rich friends laughing nearby and lowered her voice. "Things are hard here too, Mama," she lied quietly. "I will try." She ended the call quickly. The moment she turned around, she bought the expensive handbag without hesitation, smiling as if nothing had happened. That same night, her father lay coughing in bed back home while her mother sat beside him, holding his hand and praying silently. The girl who once cried from poverty had now learned to ignore it. One early morning, when the village was still quiet and the sky was pale with the first light of dawn, loud banging shook Grace's family house. Heavy fists struck the wooden door again and again until the sound echoed through the small compound. "Open this door!" a harsh voice shouted from outside.
"We did not come here to beg." Grace's parents woke up in fear, their hearts sinking immediately because they already knew who it was. The same group of moneylenders who had given them the money to send Grace abroad stood outside with angry faces and cold eyes. "We want our money today," one of them yelled. "Enough of your excuses." Grace's mother rushed to the door shaking. "Please, please, give us more time," she pleaded softly. "We are trying. Our daughter is working abroad." But the man laughed bitterly. "Your daughter? The one you keep talking about? Bring her or bring our money." Inside the house, Grace's father sat on the bed holding his head in silence, his face tired from years of struggle. He picked up the phone with trembling hands and called Grace. When Grace answered, her father's voice was weak but urgent. "Grace, they are here again. They are asking for the money. We are in trouble, my child." There was a short silence on the line before Grace spoke softly, her voice carefully controlled. "Papa, things are still not going well here. I'm trying, but work is difficult. I don't have money right now." Her father closed his eyes in pain. "They are not listening anymore. They say they will take everything." Grace hesitated, then repeated quietly, "I'm sorry. I can't help now." Her mother, listening beside him, took the phone with shaking hands. "Grace, we suffered for you. Please don't forget us now," she cried. Grace's voice broke slightly, but she still held back. "Mama, I'm really trying. Please understand me." Outside, the knocking became louder and more aggressive. "Time is up," the men shouted. Grace's father slowly lowered the phone. His face showed deep disappointment, but also silent understanding, as if he already knew this moment would come. He looked at his wife and said softly, "She is struggling too. Maybe she cannot help us yet." Her mother covered her mouth, crying quietly. The house felt heavy, like the walls themselves were listening to their pain. And far away, Grace sat in silence after the call, staring at nothing, her lie hanging in the air like a weight she could no longer carry. Under the brutal afternoon heat, Grace's father dragged his weak body through yet another day of farm work. The sun was merciless, pressing down on his back like fire. His hands shook as he tried to lift the hoe, but his strength was no longer there. Each step felt heavier than the last. He coughed violently, covering his mouth with a trembling hand, but the cough only grew worse, deep and painful, as though something inside him was breaking. His vision blurred. The earth beneath him began to spin slowly. "Just a little more," he whispered to himself, trying to stay on his feet, thinking of Grace, thinking of why he had to endure it. But suddenly, his knees gave way. He collapsed hard onto the dry soil, breathing sharply, unable to arise again. A nearby farmer ran toward him, shouting, "He has fallen! Help him!" Soon, villagers gathered, panic spreading quickly as they lifted him carefully and rushed him toward the small village hospital. Inside the hospital, the air was cold and unwelcoming. Nurses looked at his condition and shook their heads. "We cannot start treatment without payment," one of them said flatly. "But he's dying," his wife cried, holding his hand tightly as tears ran down her face. "Please, I will pay later. Just help him now." But the answer did not change. Rules are rules. Outside the hospital walls, she trembled as she dialed Grace's number again and again. Meanwhile, far away in a luxury ballroom filled with music and flashing lights, glasses clinked, people danced, and expensive perfume filled the air. Her phone vibrated inside her handbag non-stop. "Mama calling, Mama calling." One of her friends leaned closer and laughed. "Who is disturbing you this much? Ignore them and enjoy life." Grace forced a small smile, her heart uneasy. She stepped aside and saw the repeated calls from her mother. For a moment, her fingers hesitated, then shame crept in. The music, the laughter, the watching eyes around her, it all pressed on her. Slowly, she pressed a button and switched the phone off. Silence. Back in the hospital, her father lay struggling to breathe, his chest rising weakly as his wife held his hand tightly. "Stay with me," she cried. "Please don't leave me." His lips trembled as he whispered faintly, "Has Grace called?" His wife froze. Tears filled her eyes as she forced a small lie through her pain. "Yes, she will call soon." The father closed his eyes slowly, holding on to that last piece of hope. Moments later, his breathing faded completely. His hand went still inside hers, and the room fell into silence as the man who believed in his daughter's future finally let go of his own. Morning came slowly over the city as Grace woke up in her luxury apartment with a heavy head and tired eyes. The memories of last night's music, laughter, and expensive wine still lingered faintly in her mind. She sat up slowly, rubbing her face as if trying to wash away the discomfort. Then she reached for her phone carelessly, the way someone checks an ordinary message. The moment she turned it on, the screen lit up violently. Hundreds of missed calls appeared one after another, all from her mother. Her heart paused. A strange, cold fear crept into her chest. "What is this?" she whispered. Her fingers trembled as she opened the first notification. Before she could think further, a voice note appeared. Her hand shook as she pressed play. At first, there was only silence. Then the sound of crying filled the room. Her mother's voice came broken, weak, and full of pain. "Grace," she sobbed, "your father is gone. He waited for you. He kept asking for you." The word hit like a storm. Grace froze completely. The phone slipped slightly in her hand, but she could not move. The room around her suddenly felt strange, as if the air had been taken away. The soft bed, the warm lights, the luxury curtains, everything now felt empty and cold. "No," she whispered faintly. "Mama, what are you saying?" She tried calling back immediately, her hands shaking violently, but the call would not connect properly. She stood up suddenly, knocking over a glass on the table. It shattered on the floor, but she did not even look at it. Her breathing became heavy. This cannot be true. He was fine. He was walking, she kept repeating like a broken prayer. Then another message came through. Her mother's voice again, even weaker this time. We called you so many times. He kept asking for you before he died. Grace screamed, "No!" and dropped to her knees. The phone fell from her hand as her body began to shake uncontrollably. I switched it off. I just switched it off for a little while, she cried, as if trying to explain to someone who was no longer there. The silence in the apartment became unbearable. No music, no laughter, no life, only her broken voice echoing inside the walls. She pressed her hands against her head and cried loudly, rocking back and forth on the floor like a child. "Papa, oh, please don't leave me," she sobbed, but there was no answer. Only the cruel silence of a world that had already moved on without her father. Grace returned to the village, dressed in expensive clothes that once made her feel powerful, but now felt heavy on her skin, like shame. As the car entered the dusty road, she expected noise, celebration, maybe relief. But there was nothing like that anymore. Only silence. Villagers stood at a distance watching her pass. Their faces were not smiling. They were hard, tired, almost cold. Some whispered to each other as she stepped out of the car. "So she has come back," one woman said quietly. "Now she remembers where she came from," another replied bitterly. Grace lowered her head and walked faster, her heart beating violently. The same people who once clapped for her now looked at her like a stranger. She reached her home and saw her mother sitting outside in black cloth, her eyes swollen from endless crying. Grace ran forward immediately, falling to her knees. "Mama, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I tried to call. But her mother did not move. She did not open her arms. She only looked at her with deep, exhausted pain, as if something inside her had already broken forever. Grace froze, confused and shaking. "Mama, please," she whispered again. Then her mother finally spoke, her voice low and heavy, like a final judgment. "Your father died believing you were too busy becoming important." The words struck Grace like a blow to the chest. She stopped breathing for a moment. Her legs weakened beneath her. No, Mama, don't say that." But her mother continued softly, tears falling again. "He asked for you until his last breath. He kept asking if you called." Grace let out a broken cry and collapsed onto the ground, holding her head as grief overwhelmed her completely. "Papa, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she cried repeatedly. But there was no reply. Only the sound of her mother's silent suffering beside her. The funeral day came with heavy clouds covering the sky. The entire village gathered quietly, no longer in celebration, but in mourning. Men stood with bowed heads. Women cried softly. The same people who once praised her father now spoke of his sacrifice in trembling voices. "He walked himself to death for his daughter," an elder said sadly. "He never stopped believing in her," another replied. Grace stood there frozen, unable to speak or move, her body shaking as guilt consumed her completely. Every word spoken felt like another wound inside her heart. Then, after the burial, an old neighbor walked slowly toward her, holding a small rusty metal box. "He kept this," the man said gently. Grace took it with trembling hands and opened it slowly. Inside were old photographs, her childhood drawings, her school pictures, and letters she had once sent home. At the very bottom was a faded picture of her standing at the bus park before leaving the village, her father holding it carefully as if it was something sacred. Grace stared at it, and for the first time, she understood something painful. Even when she forgot them, they never forgot her. Inside the small rusty metal box, Grace found a world she had forgotten. There were her childhood drawings, carefully folded and protected as if they were treasures. There were old school awards, slightly faded but still shining with her name. There were letters she had written when she was still innocent, telling her parents her dreams, her fears, her hope. At the bottom lay an airport photograph, the day she left the village, smiling with tears in her eyes, while her father stood behind her, holding pride he never spoke loudly about. Every piece inside that box was arranged with care, as if her father had been protecting her life inside it. Not the life she lived abroad, but the life she once came from. Grace touched each item slowly, her hands trembling more with every second. It felt like her father was speaking to her through silence. A neighbor stood nearby and said softly, "He never threw anything away, even when he had nothing left." Another added, "He used to sit alone at night, looking at your pictures, smiling." Grace pressed the box to her chest and broke completely. "Papa, why did you still love me like this?" she whispered through tears. Even after she abandoned him, he never stopped being proud of her. That moment changed something inside Grace forever. Days turned into weeks, and grief slowly pushed her into action. She cleared every debt her parents had left behind, one by one, until silence replaced the fear that once lived in their home. She returned to the village and rebuilt the old house, making it strong again, like it once was in her childhood memories. She opened a small clinic in her father's name and began sponsoring children who, like her once, dreamed of escaping poverty. She gave scholarships, food, and hope to families struggling the way hers once did. The village slowly began to change again, and people who once spoke bitterly now spoke softly with respect. But even with all the good she did, Grace was never the same again. Something inside her remained broken, like a wound that never fully healed. Years later, she returned once again to the place she feared the most, the graveyard. Rain fell gently over the land, turning the soil dark and soft. She knelt in front of her father's grave, her hands trembling as she touched the cold earth. "Papa," she whispered, "I became successful, but I failed the people who mattered most." Her voice broke as the rain mixed with her tears. She stayed there in silence, as if waiting for forgiveness that would never come. The camera slowly pulled away, leaving her alone under the falling rain. Sometimes the greatest poverty is forgetting the hands that lifted you.